Thank you. Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. I'm Robert John Hughes. I'll be hosting this Prelude today, and my job is to kind of whet your appetite for what's to come, but I have a lot of help. We'll get to these guys in a minute. First of all, just so I know, anybody in the building for the first time? Wow.
Yay.
A lot of you. A lot of you. Welcome. I hope you enjoy it. You're going to hear some sounds of music, the quality of the music and the way it's reproduced in these facilities like you've never heard before. So I hope you really enjoy it. Okay. So we have two artists that we're going to have a chance to talk to. First, from Columbus, Ohio. He grew up in a musical family. He is a classically trained pianist who has made a major name for himself in the world of jazz. His latest album is called The Vagabond, and it's a jazz record, but intriguingly, it's also got some Prokofiev and some Philip Glass in there. He is a licensed private pilot, which I thought was interesting. And Wynton Marsalis, who knows him pretty well, has called him the real deal, Mr. Aaron Diehl. And next to him is the man behind the ideas that bring us all together this afternoon. He was born in Tel Aviv. He's a classically trained pianist and recording artist, performs with artists, with orchestras all over the world. The New York Times calls him one of the most admired pianists of his generation, and he's serving his third season as the musical director of Summerfest here at La Jolla Music Society. Please welcome Inon Barnatan. So good to get to talk to you guys. I was just looking at my notes, and Aaron reminded me of this. Exactly 2 years ago, yesterday, the three of us were together in this building on the stage next door talking about exactly this kind of program.
Really? It was
Yeah.
Almost to the day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and then of course, in the middle of that was COVID. And Summerfest became a bunch of streaming concerts. And now it's back. And when I look at this, when I was doing the prep to figure out what to talk to you guys about, I was just blown away by the way in which that initial idea of jazz and classical seems to have exploded. Am I overreacting, Inon?
No, it is kind of an explosion in some ways because our the jazz program that we did a couple years ago was just three people. It was just myself, Aaron, and Cecile McLaurin-Salvant. And the idea behind that was to really blur the lines between what we consider jazz and classical. We have it so kind of segregated in our minds sometimes. And both Aaron and Cecile are so they are both classically trained. They're so knowledgeable and proficient and amazing at classical music and jazz that it felt like such a beautiful way to blur those lines. And today we do it with how many people on stage? I'm not sure. A lot of people on stage. But we kind of, as the evening progresses, we expand both into jazz and while blurring the lines, and then kind of end up with this never before heard version of Rhapsody in Blue.
Yeah. Now this is the third of your American Perspectives series, and when I look back at the questions that I asked you, frankly, I'm a little embarrassed because in the context of the program, I was trying to reach for connecting classical and jazz. I'm not a classically trained musician. I'm not a jazz musician. I'm just a music fan. And I found that it was really hard to get the questions to flow. But then when I look at what you've created this season with all of these things in the American Perspectives, it's like, all right, you're illustrating over and over again that these and a whole bunch of other American strains of music are really connected.
Absolutely. Last weekend, we explored how gospel influenced classical music and vice versa. And we had a gospel quartet interweaved with classical music that was inspired by. And I think there was classical music. We think of it as something coming from Europe, and a lot of it came from Europe. But these European composers were so entranced by some of those sounds they heard here. A lot of them came over here. A lot of the composers on this program, two composers on the program are Europeans that came to America and just were blown away by what they heard, by the jazz that they heard, and decided this is the new language of music. Of course, during the 20s, it was the roaring 20s, it was such a big kind of emergence of jazz. And so yesterday we explored film and music and how visual imagery and how the landscape inspired American composers. So this is all part of the Synergy series. The Synergy series is really a way that I started it with Clara Tsai to kind of illuminate classical music in different light, to kind of look at it from different lenses. So, and to have these collaborations between people from different fields and create something that's bigger than the sum of its parts.
Now, in that program that we talked about 2 years ago, you were, right in the middle of that. You were a big part of it, and you're back now. I'm guessing, have you guys known each other for a long time? Was this the first time you worked together 2 years ago?
I think, yes, formally that was the first time we ever worked together. And I met Inon back around 2015. I remember this was in Harlem at Marcus Samuelson's restaurant called the Red Rooster. And I was doing, I think, a CD release.
Well, there's a jazz club downstairs.
Oh, yes.
It wasn't in the restaurant.
It wasn't in the restaurant. It was a jazz club downstairs. And I was doing a CD release, and Wynton Marsalis was there. He was playing. And Inon was there, and Wynton said, "Oh, you have to meet this great pianist, Inon Barnatan." So from that moment, we struck up a relationship, and then I got the opportunity to play with the New York Philharmonic a few years ago, Alan Gilbert, and I played Concerto in F, and the first person I called was Inon to be like, "Look, I've not really done this ever with a major orchestra. Can you please help me?" And he said, "Oh yeah, man, I'll help you." And so he
didn't need much help.
But yeah, he was instrumental in all of that. So yeah, we've known each other for, I guess, 5-6 years, and it's really been a great friendship, and also be able to collaborate with someone like Inon, who's so musical. I mean, not just talking about the genre of quote unquote classical music, but I mean, he has huge ears. So when we were playing last time, there was a piece, I think it was "Love Me or Leave Me." It was a version that Nina Simone did, and she played some kind of quasi-Baroque counterpoint on her recording. And Inon was like, "Okay, I'm going to transcribe this recording, and I'm going to just play what she played on the record." I said, "Man, your ears are too big for that. You really can hear. You should improvise." And he did.
Yeah, yeah, they were very crafty, because I came prepared with kind of what I heard on the recording, and Aaron was like, "Oh no, you don't. We're changing the key."
That's right.
We're changing the key, and you're improvising, and it was one of the scariest things in my. But it was just so I knew that he was on stage. He'll rescue me if I needed to, because it's such a. I mean, we think about jazz and classical as being too close, and in some ways they are closely related in terms of the language a lot of the times, but in terms of playing. They're so different. I feel of classical musicians normally more like actors. We get a script and we kind of bring it to life, whereas the process of playing jazz is so different. And trying to get into the mind of a jazz musician is one of the most fascinating and just terrifying things for a classical musician.
Well, I also think of music in general, no matter what the genre is, like as a language, right? And there is a language to the compositions of Ravel. Ravel had a language. Bach certainly had a language. He's sort of the foundation of Western musical language. Mozart, anybody. And so learning that language, whatever that is a process. And in jazz, fortunately, we have recordings of all of these greats, John Coltrane or Miles Davis or whomever, Louis Armstrong. We have recordings of that actual language. So in some ways, it is simpler for us to actually take in what that language is and then be able to refine it for our own individual needs, as opposed to music that was written 300 years ago, 250 years ago, where there's no recorded record of it. And so it's a very different process.
Yeah, it's fascinating because, and most of the concert today is about the point in history in which those two things collided, and there's so many more connections, and I actually keep discovering connections. For example, the first piece on the program is a movement of a Ravel violin sonata, and he discovered jazz and was fascinated with jazz even before he came to America, and he wrote the sonata with this movement's blues, and he kind of writes it as a Frenchman's idea of blues, and it's kind of I call it a croissant witch. Just like a delicious mix of the two cultures. But then he came with this piece to New York and met Gershwin, and they went to jazz clubs in Harlem, and really he was so influenced by Rhapsody in Blue, which was written before, and was just entranced with it. And then another person who came on this program, Mio, who actually taught David Brubeck, I think.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, Brubeck, and also came to New York and went to Harlem to jazz clubs and was just absolutely entranced by it, and decided to start writing in a jazz idiom. And one of the most kind of prolific French classical composers, and suddenly he's Bernstein said that the piece that we're playing today, the Création du Monde, is not a flirtation with jazz, but a real love affair, and that's kind of the what we're trying to examine here, is how those two worlds mesh, and collide is actually not the word; it's how they really kind of intermingle, and it's just fascinating musically.
Yeah, and American jazz and blues artists have always been greatly respected in France, sometimes more so than here. And Ravel, in 1928, wrote an article entitled "Take Jazz Seriously."
Yeah.
Why do you think it is that we have to have jazz, our art form, coming out of the African American experience in this country? Why do we have to have that reflected back to us from France? Or do we have to?
Oh, that's a loaded question.
That is a loaded
It's my job.
and it's. I mean, I'd let you take that, but it is. When you hear Gershwin's blues, you also realize, as incredible as it is, that it's somewhat divorced from its implications. It's not. It's written. He understands the idiom. He doesn't quite. There is not that internalization in some ways of where the blues really came from, but there is that conversation of what that actually means. I don't know how much he really kind of, so that's a really interesting thing. He did that to a lot of other cultures, by the way. Ravel writes Spanish music better than any Spanish composer. And they kind of, that was part of the milieu at the time. I mean, that's part of what they were doing, is that they were absorbing these influences and kind of really internalizing them and kind of creating something that's a mesh of what they had inside and what they've internalized. But I'll let you.
I mean, I think especially in the early 20th century, I mean, there's certain kind of racial and socioeconomic connections with both forms of music. I remember I was watching a documentary about the great pianist Austrian pianist Friedrich Gulda, and he played some jazz. He was actually pretty good, and he said, this is a paraphrase, but it's basically like, one of the issues with how jazz music and classical music are seen, it's like one came from sort of a socioeconomically repressed milieu, and then the other from a very aristocratic, sort of highbrow culture. And I think even today people have issues grappling with that. What the connections between, not just between the two, but especially with jazz music, where it comes from, the fact that it is an African American art form. And I just think it's just, for some people, it's still hard to grapple with that and also take it seriously. Someone like Bessie Smith or someone like Jelly Roll Morton, to put that on the same plane as someone like Bartok. And what's interesting about Bartok's music is heavily influenced by Hungarian folk music, right? I mean, that's a lot of his music incorporates that. And so with jazz, when classical musicians and composers using jazz, that is a folk music. It is very much a folk music that's indigenous to this country.
Yeah, and I think there was in some ways, especially in France, but also in this country, a tendency to view jazz to a certain extent, or parts of jazz, as entertainment, as opposed to serious music. And that's one thing that Ravel and a lot of these composers were trying to do, is to say, no, this is amazing music. And with the same thing with the gospel last week. That Dvořák, when Dvořák, the great composer Dvořák, came to direct the conservatory in New York, and made a statement to the press that why are American composers trying to all sound like Brahms and other European composers, where they have their own folk tradition here, African American spirituals, folk songs, which of course was the birth of all what we're talking about, saying that this should be the basis of American music, not Brahms and not Mozart, and these trying to see how tonight and how both European and American composers grappled with that, and last year how American composers grappled with that kind of tradition of actually using African American folk music as the idiom.
I want to take you through the program, and obviously we could talk for a couple hours, it seems,
Yes.
about this.
It's a
but
lot.
So we open up with the Ravel, and it's you, Inon, and a violin.
Yeah.
And then there's the Gunther Schuller Wind Quintet. Tell us about that piece.
It's a very short piece. I think it's about 6 or 7 minutes, 3 movements. But Gunther Schuller was an American composer who he coined the phrase "the third stream" because he thought there should be something, a term for something that's neither in the classical world nor in the jazz world, but a third stream. He coined that phrase after he wrote this piece, but regardless, he thought of a lot of his music, and this in particular, as lying somewhere, whether comfortably or uncomfortably, somewhere in between the two genres. And this little beautiful short wind quintet, there's a blues movement, there's a toccata. I mean, he just tries to really assimilate the two the way that Gershwin did, for example.
So the way the program is structured, you open it up, and then right there in the middle, then you come on with the trio and the entire orchestra. And it's a big orchestra. Looks like 15, 18 pieces?
Maybe more than that.
Yeah.
20, 25.
I mean, it's going to be busy on stage today. You're going to see a lot of activity. The stage crew and stage managers are going to earn their pay today.
Oh yes, I mean I was a little late because we were going through. I'm really putting them through their paces.
Yeah. So, and this is we're going to hear selections from the Zodiac Suite from an American composer whose name is M.L. Williams. I never heard the name. I imagine it's unfamiliar to a lot of people. Tell us the story of M.L. Williams.
Mary Lou Williams. So Mary Lou Williams was a pianist and composer who actually was the teacher of musicians like Thelonious Monk and Dizzy Gillespie. And they would all, those musicians would all go to Mary Lou's house in Harlem and study harmony and theory with her. She was what I say. She was sort of like the Nadia Boulanger of jazz music. If anybody know who Nadia Boulanger was a composer and a great theorist and a teacher. But anyhow, so Mary Lou Williams wrote this piece, the Zodiac Suite, a set of pieces all based on the sign, inspired by the different zodiac signs. She wrote this in 1944, and she originally recorded it for her trio. And then end of 1945, she premiered this version at Town Hall in New York City. She only had one performance of it, and unfortunately, it didn't go too well. There's a recording that has surfaced of the live premiere, and you can hear the sections where the orchestra wasn't comfortable, and so Mary Lou would have to jump in and play the parts on the piano and things like that. So she didn't really get the treatment I feel like it deserves. So one of my missions in the last few years has been to get this piece played, because it is a great piece of music. Unfortunately, we won't be able to hear the whole suite, but each movement is dedicated to a different musician who held that sign. And she was very much inspired by Duke Ellington. Duke was a mentor of hers. And Duke Ellington premiered a piece in 1943 at Carnegie Hall called Black, Brown, and Beige. And that was actually sort of a response to Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, if you will, in terms of having this kind of third stream element of sort of a formal piece, long form piece in the jazz language. So that's how we came up to the Zodiac Suite in 1945. She had other versions that she arranged. She did one. There's, I think in 1946, she did a concert at Carnegie Hall with what was maybe the New York Pops Orchestra, the Carnegie Pops Orchestra. And she, I think, either played parts of the Zodiac or the entire the suite. But she did do another version for entire symphonic orchestra about a year later. And there's no recording of that. I don't even think the parts and score exist. So I'm just really excited that this version has surfaced in the last few years, and people can hear what it sounds like.
Yeah, and the original plan for this concert was actually just to do the trio version, and then Aaron is like, we've got to do this version that never gets played, and it's just amazing. He just did it with the New York Philharmonic actually during the pandemic, and that's how the concert got monstrous in terms of the amount of players. Because as soon as he said, I said, of course it has to be that version, and then of course we had to adapt Rhapsody in Blue and create our own version for this ensemble, and we're just coming up with this version for two pianists of Rhapsody in Blue. But in between, and it's going to be, I kind of think of it, not your grandmother's Rhapsody in Blue type of thing, because he's improvising, we're passing things around, I don't know what's going to happen. But it's in the spirit of jazz, in the spirit of kind of reacting in real time, and between the kind of the orchestra and we are a little bit freer and can kind of play around with it more.
Yeah, what's interesting about that piece too is so many people know the piece now. It's really been a part of American culture for such a long time, and everyone has their favorite version or whatever. But the piece was an experiment, and something that Gershwin only had 3 weeks to write, because he was surprised. I think it was a magazine publication or something that had announced that this piece was going to be written for this premiere, and Gershwin was like, "Oh, okay, I guess I have 3 weeks to write it." So even in the premiere, certain parts of the piece were improvised, and if you look at the original score. I went to the Library of Congress a few years ago and saw the original manuscript, and there was something scribbled in like, make sure to look at the pianist or Gershwin or something like that to know when to bring the band in. So now all the cadenzas are sort of established, but Gershwin definitely was influenced by pianists such as Art Tatum and Fats Waller and James P. Johnson, all these stride pianists, who were very free in their approaches to music. So I think it's also important to keep that in mind. And I think in a time where we listen to a piece like Rhapsody in Blue and it's like it's set in stone. But I feel like any music it's fair game. Nothing's really set in stone. There's always room for expansion with the right musician who knows enough about the language.
Yeah.
That's right. Gershwin was 25 when he wrote it?
Something like 24, 25, something
Yeah,
like that, yeah.
amazing.
And there's another piece in between the Zodiac Suite and the Gershwin. That's the Bernstein riffs, which actually is for full orchestra and clarinetist, but they're playing a version that I found for jazz trio and clarinet with the great Anthony McGill, and of course his trio. So that's going to be a little interlude in the middle there.
That one's hard because it's for an
Sorry.
ensemble. Yeah, it's for an ensemble, but the piano part is all it's like a reduction of the ensemble. So
Yeah.
it's really fun. But Anthony is great. And I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, and basically he has to play the part of 30 different musicians.
Yes.
Sorry about that.
I know.
But it's but Bernstein was of course a person who followed in that example and was one of the people that could really fuse those two things so successfully, the two art forms.
Can't wait to hear it. We have a couple minutes. Questions from anybody? Yes, sir, right here.
Yes. Can you comment about external influences on American jazz, like Latin music?
Did you all hear the question?
Ex-
Okay.
external influences. I mean, immediately what comes to mind, Dizzy Gillespie. He was a frequent collaborator of Chano Pozo. That was one of the first instances, not the very first, but one of the early instances of Latin American music and Afro-Cuban music coming into the fold of jazz. I mean, there are many examples later on with Antonio Carlos Jobim. There's a recording of Jelly Roll Morton from the Library of Congress. Alan Lomax, who was a great musicologist, he has something like 40 hours of tape interviewing Jelly Roll. And Jelly Roll talked about what he called the Spanish tinge, which is this rhythm. And that's formally called the habanero rhythm, but Jelly Roll called it the Spanish tinge. And you listen to Jelly playing some kind of riff, some kind of progression with this rhythm. And then he said, well, look, we take the Spanish tinge and then we take the blues and listen to how that sounds. And you really hear the shift and the melding of it. And he says it really changes the color of something from red to blue. And, it's very fascinating how that rhythm in particular is so influential throughout Western music. I mean, you'll find it in all corners. And in pop music today, that one rhythm you can find just about anywhere. It's significant influence,
Including
no doubt.
Rhapsody in Blue, actually.
Including Rhapsody, thank you.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, one more. Got time for a real quick one. Yes, sir.
I have a question that relates to what Aaron just said about classical music being more sophisticated or aristocratic music and jazz being more on the lower end of the spectrum. And when you think about one of the reasons perhaps why American composers haven't adapted the themes from blues or jazz might be related to the fact that the Great War reflects those same differences between aristocratic members of America and the blues jazz scene in America. So when you say you've got a Ravel and you've got a Shostakovich and you've got numerous other European composers who loved the jazz music because it had something new and different, in America there was that social, economic, political divide that maybe interfered with American composers to embrace the beauty and the magic and the value of jazz. Can you comment on that?
Oh, wow.
I don't know what I can add to that right there.
I hope you all heard it, but that's a whole 3-hour symposium right there. in terms of the highbrow, and I think we're talking about the origins, right? We're talking about where the music came from. I mean, classical music kind of developed from, the dances in the king's court, and then that turned into Baroque instrumental music that turned into, and so it's that the origins of it were there partly because that's that was the way that it happened historically. But then I think a lot of classical composers felt that there was something missing, a real connection with people, not with just not. So that's how I think folk music began to creep into to classical music. But in terms of in the States, in terms of what you're talking about, that's a huge.
That's a big topic.
That's a big topic.
Maybe fuel for next year's Summerfest.
Let's talk after the show.
Yeah.
Because I mean, sadly, I have to kind of prepare and because we start in half an hour, right?
Half an hour. Yeah, they gotta go. You gotta go settle
but
into
thank you
your
for
seats.
that question. It's beautiful.
I would
question.
encourage you to read the program notes by Eric Bromberger. They're amazing, and I think you'll get a lot out of those notes, and it'll help you enjoy this afternoon even more. And when the show is over, don't rush off, because you saw the instruments out in the courtyard. Aaron Diehl and the trio will be there to continue the afternoon's music, so hang out with us right there. And guys, I want to thank you. It was great to talk to you again.
Thank you.
Aaron Diehl, Inon Barnatan, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for coming.